Great, we can get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connecting from today. My name is Anherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. And I am really delighted to be serving as your host today for this webinar entitled Introduction to the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations, organized by ICVA and PHAP. Climate change is already altering the work we do as humanitarian organizations and the lives of the people that we support. The current approach to humanitarian action, policies, programs, ways of working, skills, and operating techniques need to change for humanitarian actors to be better prepared, be able to respond to impacts, and at the same time to limit our own impact on the climate and the environments in which we live. With this event today, we are launching ICVA's and PHAP's new learning stream on climate change and humanitarian action, in which over the coming months, we will look at different aspects of our response as a sector to the climate crisis. We wanted to start this series with an overview of the recently launched Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. This new charter sends a clear signal that humanitarian organizations have a key role to play in addressing crises faced by communities due to the climate and environmental crises. And in the coming events of this series, we'll be focusing on how humanitarian organizations can live up to the commitments laid out in this charter. Now, to help introduce the charter, we're joined by two speakers today. First, Amir Kuzam is a policy advisor with the ICRC's Division of Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy. He supports the ICRC's engagement on the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations and other elements of its work on climate and conflict. And Nishani Jayamaha is the Learning and Program Coordinator with ICVA, in which role she has been deeply engaged in this topic, and she sits on the Advisory Committee on the Climate and Environment Charter. I should mention that Nishani does often join me, as many of you know, as a co-facilitator in ICVA's and PHAP's learning streams, but today she will be in a presenting role. And to get us started, I'd like to hand over to you, Nishani.
Thank you so much, Angharad. It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you. An amazing array of people that has joined. A warm welcome to everyone. It's actually our 6th online ICVA PHAP learning stream. Isn't it amazing? We've been doing this together for quite a while. And this particular one, we wanted to concentrate on climate change and humanitarian action because it provides a platform for broader humanitarian community to better understand how we can reduce our own impact of climate change by accelerating our own action and increasing our environmental sustainability in line with the commitments of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. Before I go too much into the learning stream itself, I think I'd like to highlight a bit why climate change and humanitarian action is an important topic for ICVA and for our members. In 2017, when we consulted our members about what topics were important for them for the strategy during that time, only 14% of members indicated that climate change should be a priority. Then when we consulted our members again in 2019, just 2 years later for our 2030 strategy, over 90% of our 130 members, in addition to our partners, highlighted the importance of the intersection between climate and environmental change and humanitarian action. And as a result, ICVA's new strategy towards 2030 presents 5 transformations, including one that specifically addresses the impact of climate change on humanitarian action. So furthermore to this, the conversation continued, and at ICVA's annual conference, we also focused on the role NGOs played and are playing in adapting the way we work so that we're better prepared to face the impacts of climate change, ensuring that we leave no one behind. And especially when we're delivering programs to support refugees, displaced and vulnerable populations in conflict and complex emergency contexts and other contexts like natural disaster contexts. So maybe a little background on how did ICVA get involved in the charter. So the ICRC and the IFRC, the Red Cross movement, basically reached out to ICVA in, around 2020 to be a member of the advisory committee that was drafting the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. The advisory committee includes a number of humanitarian and climate actors, ranging from UN, civil society, academia, Red Cross, Red Crescent movements, etc. So following this, we as ICVA realized this was an amazing opportunity to galvanize our membership, to join the consultations to develop a momentous, it was a momentous time to consult the charter development and receive feedback on the draft charter from over 50 NGOs, including non-ICVA members as well. So why do we think that this was why did we think that this was an important initiative to join? And one of the compelling reasons was that we as NGOs have been realizing more and more that it is urgent that we take transformative action to help reduce the humanitarian impacts of climate change and environment crises that we are facing right now on the populations that we serve. So through the charter, we realize that we need to send others as well as a clear signal that humanitarian organizations, especially NGOs, have a key role to play in addressing this crisis. We also have a role not to just do no harm, but also to do good and to reduce our impact on the climate from humanitarian programs and operations. Some may say that humanitarian sector impact is just a drop in the ocean compared to the impact of other sectors on the climate. But as Greta Thunberg rightly pointed out at this pre-summit, there is no planet B. Change is not only possible, but it is necessary, and change needs to happen from within. And where better to start actually than with us. And the charter is designed to galvanize and steer collective action. It represents our sector's commitment to do our part, to work together to ensure that our actions reduce the impact of the crisis and convince others to do the same. And ICVA is best place to do so. ICVA, with its over 130 members at the General Assembly in May 2021, adopted the commitment and motion to action, which will guide the network with principles set out in the Charter. Members, through the motion to action, committed that they will consider signing the Charter individually and indicate when they will be also able to measure their implementation, and that members will share widely existing tools, guidance, and lessons learned. We will review the motion to action at ICVA's next General Assembly in 2024. And as part of the various other initiatives that support the implementation of the Charter, ICVA is also part of the Carbon Accounting Tool, partner roundtable on climate financing, which focus on conflict and fragile contexts, and a few other initiatives that Amir will also mention more in his presentation. So, and furthermore, just to mention that ICVA ourselves have an environment policy. So the link will be shared by my colleague Edith, so that you understand that ICVA too, as a responsible organization, is committed to being environmentally friendly. This basically leads us to our learning stream that focuses specifically on how we can concretely put into practice and apply the Charter commitments in our day-to-day humanitarian action, be it in our planning processes, organizational change, programming, or operations. This was considered something important that our members asked from us to understand better. And as a result, during this learning stream, we will showcase how NGOs and partners alike have been putting these commitments into practice in their own organizations and the work they do across the globe. So over to you, Amir.
Thank you so much, Nishani, and thank you, Anghard, and for all of the organizers for this opportunity. And just to start, I do want to reiterate what Nishani said, that when the charter was first envisioned and the development process started until it's been adopted and is now open, we really did see a sea change in how humanitarians saw the relevance of a document like this and the relevance of climate and environmental action to the humanitarian imperative and mandate. And it was really interesting to see, and I think that's kind of reflected today in a number of I guess 180 or odd people on this stream. So it's really exciting to see that there isn't a question anymore. What do we, why do we have to speak to this issue? It's much more about how and how we can work together to speak effectively. So I'll go a little bit into the ambitions for the Charter, what the Charter is, why it is a little bit different from a number of other documents that exist in the space, and then run through the commitments that are included in the Charter, a little bit of explanation and background for why they're listed and termed the way they are. So what did we want to do with the Charter? The development of the Charter started in 2020. And as Nishani mentioned, it was led by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, along with the support of an advisory committee of experts across the climate and environmental and humanitarian fields, academics, researchers, and practitioners. And the idea was to come up with a document that could be a central and normative document for the humanitarian sector, written by humanitarians for humanitarians. The idea and ambition was to rally collective action from all of us in response to a crisis that was increasingly being seen within the sector as large scale and relevant to a huge cross section of our work and our responses that already existed. And after rallying collective action, the form of that action was envisioned to be transformational change in the way we work and the way we speak about how we work. The way to package this and the vision for the Charter was as a very simple and accessible and an aspirational document of voluntary commitments that organizations take on their own, commit voluntarily, and are able to frame and communicate in an effective way. And it was critical to us that this document was not seen as imposing additional constraints and additional requirements on humanitarian organizations. We wanted this to be written by people who would use it, by the organizations who would adopt it, to reflect the real concerns that they had about their ability to react, their ability and capacity to respond and to speak to these issues as they became more and more relevant to their work. One of the inspirations behind the Charter is the 1994 Code of Conduct. And so when we were starting to look at how to frame it, that's one of the documents we looked at a lot. As many of you or all of you are aware, the Code of Conduct was written for humanitarian or for NGOs, for relief NGOs. The one key difference between the Charter and the Code of Conduct was that the Code of Conduct was not open to UN agencies. When we were writing the Charter, to reflect the interest from that element of the sector, we decided that it would be open to all humanitarian organizations, including think tanks that work on humanitarian issues, including networks, and including UN agencies. Marcus, Edith, could we go to the next slide? So what is in the Charter, and very briefly, why is this different from other documents that exist across the sector? There are a number of calls to action and commitments, among them ICVA's pledge, and this is not designed in any way to replace many of those documents which we think are really important and are critical and help to inform the contents of the Charter. The vision was, could we package and could we present an ambitious, aspirational, and holistic vision of humanitarian response in the context of the climate and environmental crises in a document that could be adopted quite widely and committed to by a number of different organizations of extremely different capacities, mandates, and scale. We did not want this to be strictly a Global North document. We did not want it to be a document for strictly large NGOs and international NGOs, nor did we want it to be a document that was geared directly to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. This was supposed to be a universal, and it was intended and designed to be universal and cross mandate and cross organizational document. So what is in it? So the Charter is composed of 7 high-level commitments, and they are split a little bit between the first two, which are the high-level commitments about that we make on what we're going to do and how we're going to respond. And the next 5 are the how we intend to fulfill those commitments. So in commitment 1, we talk about how we're going to step up our own response and our own action to growing humanitarian needs and help people adapt to the impacts of these crises. It's quite critical to see that this is the first commitment, because this is really about how we change our programs and our interventions to make sure that they are designed in a way that is climate smart and climate aware, and incorporate the risks and vulnerabilities of the communities with whom we work all over the world. This is very much about how we do humanitarian response. The second commitment is about maximizing the environmental sustainability of our own work and reducing our own emissions and environmental footprint. So as Nishani said, we cannot not change the logistics and the ways that we work in our premises, in our procurement, in lots of different fields that support our mandate. There's no planet B. So this is about our own changes and our own commitments in terms of reducing emissions. And it is also very much in line with the principle of doing no harm. We think that the humanitarian sector, although it's not large in the grand scale of things, has quite an important normative role to play in showing that we are doing our part to limit our footprint, to make sure that our interventions are as little damaging as possible, or in fact, do good. And that this can help us convince others across the sector, but also far beyond the sector in the other fields in which we are tangentially related, to change the ways that they work. So in shipping and in transportation and in building premises and all of these things, if we show that we are making changes, that can have a real ripple effect, we think. So the next 5 commitments are about how. So we're quite clear, and we were intentional in saying that to do this, we need to listen to and embrace the leadership of local communities and actors. In many places and spaces, this work is being done and being led already. And it doesn't make sense to have a headquarters-driven initiative that doesn't respond to the kinds of needs and the kind of initiatives that are already taking place in the communities in which we work. We also said that we would increase our capacity to understand the risks and develop evidence-based solutions. This is critical because one thing that we heard time and again in the development of the charter is that there isn't necessarily the data equality across organizations that are working on these issues and in humanitarian response. There are places where a large amount of data is owned and not necessarily shared. And we have not yet figured out a really good way to incorporate both the scientific data and evidence that we can collect, and also the local and indigenous knowledge about these risks and about these patterns that we have access to and should be relying on and amplifying. The next commitment is about working collaboratively. And this, is quite important, given that, as we mentioned, the humanitarian sector is not entirely large. There are a number of large firms that have market capitalizations bigger than the entire sector's annual expenditure. So we need to be conscious of that and work with others across the humanitarian sector in the development and environmental fields to increase our own capacities, but also to convince them to act in concert with us. The private sector and the political process. We need to join, our own voices to say that ambitious action is needed to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change. And we can do this in line with the next commitment, which is to use our own influence to mobilize urgent and ambitious action and environmental protection. So in processes such as the COP process and other political fora, we think the charter is a great way for us to speak as one voice, as a collective sectoral voice, to the political processes that we know will have a much bigger effect on what kind of world we live in and operate in next year and the year after, and in 10 years and in 50 years. And finally, we commit to developing and improving our own targets, our own strategies, and our own action plans while we implement these commitments. And in large part, this learning stream and similar initiatives are about how can we meet that commitment? How can we measure and monitor and report in a way that is not onerous and burdensome on organizations, but demonstrates real commitment to change? One thing we wanted to balance when we developed this charter was that we did not want it to be, we wanted it to be voluntary. We wanted organizations to sign because they wanted to commit and take on these commitments. But we also need to know that it does lead to real and concrete action. And so that's why the 7th commitment is there. Nishani, I'll pass it back to you, and then we can come back.
Thanks a lot, Amir. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Amir, and there's a few questions that are also popping up. The charter is an amazing pathway and a roadmap for NGOs and the humanitarian sector in general to give us guidance on how we can work, and that comes obviously with challenges and opportunities, and we need to, I think, from the start, realize that we have to change the way we work. And we've been talking about transformation from beyond World Humanitarian Summit times, and one of the things that Adelina Kamal, during she's the ex-AHA Center head at our annual conference in May, indicated is we need to shift our mindset from a crisis management approach to a more risk management approach. We've been always reacting to disasters, to conflict situations, but we have to recognize that we have to change. And this is a great start in terms of looking at the impacts that we are facing right now that's going to increase, and we see this more and more. And also at the same time, how do we in our programs and operations also change how we impact the climate and our environment we work in? So one of the things that I think is an opportunity is also can be a challenge is how do we recognize our local capacities and available resources? Our first responders, and the Red Cross can definitely talk to this more and more than I could, but how do we build our capacities of our first responders on the ground and the communities and our local national NGOs on the ground, but also the local authorities, disaster management actors, private sector. And these are lessons learned that we had from COVID-19, right? These are opportunities and lessons that we need to tap into. And this is part of the process of also how do we operationalize the charter that we will try and bring in more and more in our learning stream. How do we involve our communities and strengthen our communities? We, as humanitarians, tend to mostly work with the refugee or displaced communities, but we need to look at a broader community of the host community and the community that is based in the country, because they have a lot of knowledge that we are not tapping into on their own environment, be it in terms of planning, preparedness, programs, from the start to the implementation. How do we engage them and keep them engaged and get their input? And this was really stressed to us at our annual conference from our refugee youth speaker from Uganda and the Fiji youth ambassador that spoke at the final panel as well. That links directly to how do we capitalize on our local adaptation solutions. We talk about climate change adaptation. There's a lot of things happening on the ground. There's innovation. People pushed to the limit are working on their own solutions, right? So how do we then tap into these solutions and knowledge and incorporate some of them into our programs? Sometimes the development DRR world is a little bit better than our emergency and humanitarian world, and this is that cross-sector learning that we need to also understand better. How do we use weather-resistant seeds and crops for diversification? How do we reduce the stresses of flooding with the irrigation methods that have been already there from the past? Natural early warning systems that we're not using that we have been in the past using. How do we tap into this knowledge is the other thing. I think another opportunity is to be prepared to respond above and beyond the typical disaster. It's also a challenge that we are facing, is that there's longer term heat spells, drought situations that are combined with other situations like food scarcity, floods, sea level rise, and obviously we saw COVID-19 and pandemic exacerbate things. And then when we're in conflict situations, how do we work in terms of trying to minimize our impact in already difficult situations? These are, I think, some of the questions that we are struggling with as NGOs, and we want to bring some of these expertise and ways of working that others have been doing during the lessons. And this is something we need to work across the silos of humanitarian development, peace nexuses, there's a lot of lessons from other parts of the world. We heard from our colleagues in Afghanistan during the drought. Of course, now the context has changed completely, but we can still learn from those lessons, right? And that's that cross-learning that we need to fertilize. Another thing that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about how do we implement the charter and putting it into practices, while we're shifting the ways of working, it also changes a way of changing our approach to solving the problem and the situation. So this also means that there needs to be necessary resources that needs to be invested in in order to implement the commitments. To that end, we need to have the support of donors. And this is where I think ICVA's been working quite a lot with ICRC, IFRC, and Amir will speak to some of these initiatives that are in the future. But how do we advocate with donors to be ensuring that the right resources, the quality funding, the longer term flexible funding is reaching the right levels, be it at local level, national level, be it to local partners or to governments. There's different layers that we need to understand in order to implement the chart. It's not just as a individual organization. We've been, as ICVA, also working more with other organizations, other donors like DG ECHO, who's now looking at their minimum environment requirements and principles document. These are some of the things that we see donors putting in place as well to say that organizations receiving funds and working on humanitarian projects and programs need to also take this into account. So there's a dual sort of accountability that obviously to the people and the donors that we need to balance, noting that the humanitarian imperative to deliver most life-saving urgent needs are, of course, in the forefront. So when it comes to learning, and this learning stream is going to bring as much as possible from cross-sectoral learning from different parts, we see that our own organizations, our own NGO organizations have a lot of learning within that are not shared. So especially maybe bigger organizations, there's something happening in the Asia Pacific. Especially Asia Pacific is ahead of the game when it comes to anticipatory action and adaptation. How can we learn from our own organizations that are doing these work on the ground? Could we share those lessons learned? We reach out to you who are on the call and the others as well to share some of your lessons learned through the chat, through the next learning streams that are going to come up. And I think this is an opportunity that we all need to take to understand better, not just within our sector alone, but to learn across other sectors, be they the environment sector, be they the development sector, and learn from these as well. I think I'm going to stop for the moment and continue, get Ami to continue.
Thank you, Nishani. Just before I move on to some of the next points, I did want to respond to one of the things that is coming up a few times in the chat, and in response to some of the things that were said earlier. As much as this is absolutely about preparedness and reducing and managing risks and looking long term, this is certainly also about responding to needs now. And we recognize that we cannot wait to change how we need to act and how we need to respond. If we're going to do this work properly. For example, in the ICRC's work, where we are supporting communities who are affected by armed conflict and violence, we are increasingly seeing that in order to design effective prevention and protection programs, to provide water programming and assistance, we need to incorporate risks that take into account and factor climate change and climate shocks. Otherwise, these programs do not work and do not adequately meet the needs of communities. Where that is true, this is not true everywhere, but where it is true, it must be done in order to design programs and interventions that work. And in the charter, we've tried to balance those two imperatives, to respond to needs and preserve our ability to respond to humanitarian needs, while also looking forward and ensuring that programs and assistance and interventions are resilient and climate smart. The first commitment is about stepping up our response, and it is essentially speaking to adaptation programs. We recognize, and there was a point in the chat that said, as important as our work is, advocacy in the big emitting countries is just as important. That is absolutely true if we're going to make a change in what the future prognosis is for the world and for the communities with whom we work. But today and in the next days and weeks and months and years, we will also have to support adaptation in places where it's currently not happening, or is happening but is not yet informed by the right level of risk analysis or application. So this is about preparedness. It's about looking forward. It's also absolutely about preserving and increasing our capacity to respond to needs that are rising and will continue to rise. Thank you for putting the slide back. And now, so now speaking about looking forward, there are a few steps that are coming up to translate, and this also speaks to a few of the things that were raised in the chat box. Translating this in the dissemination of the charter into concrete steps, supporting organizations in implementing it. One of the things we need to do is maintain momentum. So an update on the charter, we now have about 140 signatories, and that continues to rise. And we think that the more organizations of very diverse profiles and place sign it, the greater the momentum around these commitments will be, and the greater our ability to raise the concerns that we want to raise are in political fora and in other conversations with donors, with states, with communities with whom we work. That ties directly into mobilizing others, both large emitting countries, but also other partners inside the humanitarian sector and outside with whom we work and regularly engage. And we also need to continue to share tools, share resources, and share insights. This is a commitment inside the charter, but it's also just a modality of how to make it possible. There are a few things that are happening now and that will continue to happen, and that we need to move forward with. One tool then resource, which is incredible, which has just been put in the chat box, is the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. This is where we can see a lot of really interesting science-informed analysis of risks in countries in which we work, but also tools and resources to help us inform our own programs. There are a number of hubs like this. The Climate Action Accelerator is another one, very much on the side of how do we reduce our own impact, how do we reduce our emissions as a sector or as organizations. The EHA network is another one. As the ICRC and partner organizations, we are also developing tools and we're committed to sharing those. One of them is a carbon accounting tool that we've developed for the ICRC to map our own emissions and map that to the targets and commitments we've made to cut them. And we're working now to adapt that into something that can be shared with other organizations. One learning that we had is that the budget lines of different organizations are so specific that there is not an easy tool that can just be applied to different organizations, especially with different organizational mandates, geographic scope, and size. So we're working to see how we can do that and how we can share it. Inside the movement and with a number of key partners, we're also working on initiatives such as the Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance to identify how to streamline our procurement and supply chain processes, make sure that they are as environmentally and climate conscious as possible. And we hope that insight and lessons from those processes can be shared. We also know that, as a large organization, we have the resources to devote to these kind of experimental and iterative projects. And part of the charter is about making sure that those who can do that, share that, and make sure that others in the sector and others with whom we work have access to those resources and that knowledge. The next two are kind of about knowledge development, but also about really practical implementation of the commitments. So one is targets. So in the charter, in Commitment 7, we commit to developing targets that reflect where we are as individual organizations and where we want to go. When organizations sign the charter, they are invited to share those targets with us when they're developed, and the text of the document commits organizations to developing action plans or incorporating the charter into strategies and action plans within a year. So over the last 8 months, we have been developing a bit of a library of targets that organizations either have already developed and committed to and released, or are in the process of developing. And we're going to share those targets through the website as soon as we've, in its next iteration, before the end of the year is the real hope, so that hopefully the targets that have been developed by by ourselves, by the Federation, by a number of signatories, can inspire others, and will speak to other organizations and sort of show how we can develop targets that are organization specific, effective, realistic too. And then the final piece is about standards. So what we heard a lot when we were developing the charter and after it was finalized is that organizations are keen to implement its commitments. They're keen to incorporate its insight into their programs, but there doesn't always exist an authoritative place to look for how to do that in, for example, a camp management setting or another sort of sectoral programmatic setting. So we're looking at the possibility, together with ICVA, who was so critical in convening local and national organizations to provide input into the development of the charter, to set up a consultative process wherein we would design standards that could be authoritative, that could be concise and effective in the spirit of Sphere, and hopefully with the support of some of those organizations. And that's the next step. It's something that we heard loud and clear, and it's something that we started to brainstorm and kind of blue sky with the guidance that is available already on the website. But we're conscious and we know that something more evolved, more technical and detailed needs to come. And so we're looking into that, and that's our next big step. The key part of that, I think, and we've heard this a lot, is that those standards need to be informed by the evidence. And so we are really, hoping that organizations who sign the charter and others who do this work are able to share their evidentiary data and their experiences. And we're going to be looking at how to gather that, collate it, and present it in a way that is effective and really helpful. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much to both of you. It was highly informative and really inspired not only a lot of great questions, but a lot of discussion already in the chat, which is great to see, and a terrific start to the learning stream. So we will try, we have about 20 minutes, and we'll try to get through as many questions here as we can. We have had a number of questions simply about who's been involved and in what way. So maybe we can start with a few of those. Amir, you already pointed out, some people were asking, there is a public list of signatories, and that link has been posted. But maybe just a follow-up on that, we had a question from Ingrid in the Netherlands, who was wondering more specifically about the involvement of Red Cross societies, how many of them are committed already to the Charter, and perhaps to clarify whether other NGOs can join as well. Over to you, Amir.
Thank you. And Nishani, please feel free to jump in. So the charter is open to all humanitarian organizations. And there was also, I think, an added question in the chat about environmental organizations. It's very much informed by the knowledge and the experience of environmental organizations, but the charter was designed for all humanitarian organizations to sign. And this clearly includes the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. So far, we have, I believe, 45 national societies who have signed the charter on their own. The IFRC was one of the first signatories. And there is a plan over the next few months and the next year to continue to disseminate that and support national societies in their signature and implementation of the charter, but also to look at whether the movement endorses the charter as a whole. We think it's quite powerful for individual national societies to endorse the charter because it reflects a context-specific and experiential-specific need to incorporate these things into their practice. So that's our approach. Although we were some of the leads on the development of the charter, this is very much not a movement document, and it is open to all humanitarian organizations and owned by all humanitarian organizations as well. But the current list, I think, is 47, and we anticipate quite a few more.
Okay, maybe just to follow up on that, yeah, you were mentioning that there were some questions about environmental organizations. So yeah, Julian, he was pointing out that the core humanitarian standard, the CHS, already covers a commitment to the environment. And so he was suggesting that what could be new here would be if the charter could somehow straddle the humanitarian and environmental NGO sectors, used as a bridge to drive collaboration. And with that in mind, was wondering to what extent some really environmental organizations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, World Wildlife Fund, et cetera, have been involved. Any additional comments on that?
So World Wildlife Foundation was on the advisory board. We have consulted quite widely in the space. Again, we think the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center is an amazing resource that brings together the science of climate change and environmental degradation with the humanitarian view. In terms of CHS and its relevance to the environment, clearly it's there. And our understanding is that if and when the CHS is updated, which I believe it will be, there's a regular schedule, there is a desire to increase the ties and the links to this work. Certainly, I think, Julian, that those are things that we would have to take into account during the development of standards, actually before in kind of the visioning process. And we're not sure exactly what form it will take, but it needs to respond to a need. It needs to be informed by the science, absolutely, and make those connections.
Great, thanks a lot, Amir. Nishani, if I could come back to you. We have a question from Fiona, and feel free to also throw the ball to Amir if you like, but I'll start with you, Nishani. Regarding the SDGs, they've outlined how each country should plan for a better future. How does this work complement what's being done on national levels with the SDGs? Over to you, Nishani.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, for the question. I think one of the things we need to understand better is how are we as the humanitarian sector working in the humanitarian development peace nexus, right? And this is one of the key components of how do we bridge the gap between at country level, basically, also in terms of the UN humanitarian country teams, the UN country teams getting together to look at this nexus building. And at country level, while governments and national work is done at a different level, this is where NGOs or humanitarian organizations come in terms of where is the gap. And that is where the primary responsibility is with the governments or the national responsibility. But how do NGOs then bridge that gap? So while we as humanitarians don't really link up so much with the SDGs, it's more and more evident that the nexus discussions at country levels are definitely linking that up. And climate change is integrated part of the SDGs. So we need to also understand, maybe our lingo is not the same, but in terms of our humanitarian perspectives and how do we look at our operations and programs, we can learn a lot from that development sector, as I mentioned before, to incorporate some of those best practice lessons learned on the ground, because more and more our operations are now longer term and not short term. They've been over 17 years, 30 years in some operations. So we need to look at a bit more sustainability in the way we operate as well. And I'm sure Amir has a bit more connections to that. I'd like to kind of come back to some of the few questions that have been there for NGOs, and this particular charter cannot be stressed even more. I think there was a huge input by NGOs into this charter, and there was a momentum where we were at ICVA, we were reached out by so many organizations saying we would like to do the consultations in our own country level, because it had, they felt that this is the time and we need to provide input to it. At the same time, now we need to see how can we then implement it, right? And that becomes the challenge, where with already limited resources and limited knowledge maybe in the climate sector, how do we make sure that we're putting these into our programs? It's someone was calling on more mainstreaming climate change resilience, etc., into humanitarian action, because that would be making it more robust and not just looking at piecemeal humanitarian work, development work, UNDRR work, because as mentioned, it's a long-term process of how do we work in contexts that are going to be increasingly the case now, when we're going to face more climate issues in the future. So NGOs are open to sign up. There's a huge sign up button on the website, and I think the website has been shared many a time, the link on it. And if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We are available to have a call, have a chat, and of course the learning stream is going to help more understand better the charter and what it means and how does it mean to actually put that into practice. Over.
Great, thanks so much, Nishani. Amir, I'd like to come to you with a pair of questions. We're turning now to specifically questions related to local and national NGOs. So we have one from Liban who writes, I think it's a very important topic here in Somalia when talking about climate change. Local NGOs to sign the environmental charter would be good. How does outreach to local NGOs work, and can they manage the commitments? So that's one. And then I'd also, just as it's quite related, we had an anonymous question come in just a few moments ago. What practical relevance does the charter hold to NGOs working at national level? And how can these NGOs use the charter in day-to-day work? So yeah, the spectrum of engagement all the way to that practical relevance. Over to you, Amir.
Sure, thank you. On whether or not local NGOs are signing the charter or have signed the charter and how we reach them, one way was first through the development process and the consultation process. And we were quite insistent that this would be a inclusive consultation process. And thanks to ICVA in large part, and some of our partners at various NGO roundtables and civil society roundtables, we were able to speak directly to local NGOs, including in Somalia. My belief is that as of now, out of 137 organizations that have signed the charter, about 50 are local and small NGOs. So some are signing it. There is an awareness. We have used the networks that we developed during the consultation process to reach out and encourage signatories to further disseminate the charter to their own networks. We have found that has worked. One thing we've also found that has worked is when either Red Cross, Red Crescent, national societies, or other NGOs take the charter and own it, which we think is fantastic, and hold events about the charter in the context in which they work at the local level. And we find that when it's presented that way, it's often well received, and we see a spike in signatories soon after that event. In terms of whether they can meet the commitments, we were intentional in drafting this and responding to the concerns of small NGOs that said, look, that money it's difficult, capacities are very different. We don't want this to be a burden. And so the language of the charter is written in such a way that it can be tailored to the capacity of the signatory. And that's intentional. It's not there to reduce the ambition of the commitments, but rather there to show that at every level and at every size of organization and level of intervention, there are things that really matter and can be done and incorporated into action plans and strategies and interventions. To take an example of this, there was a lot of discussion about whether in the second commitment we should explicitly reference the Paris Agreement in our emissions reduction target. And there were two reasons why we didn't do that. One is that there was quite a strong sense that Paris is not ambitious enough, and to tie the charter to a number that is already outdated would be to put it already in a place that is not relevant. But second, a specific number may deter organizations who have not yet developed the rubric to measure emissions or to really quantify their scope 1, scope 2, etc. from signing. And we didn't want to do that because the spirit of the charter is not about the technical decisions and changes that are made. It's about making sure that where relevant, the programs that organizations and signatories run are responding to the risks and reflective of the severity of the crises. Second question was about practical relevance. We did hear from many people that this is extremely important and that they see the effects of these crises in their work every day. I think that something that will be very helpful will be an accompanying document that outlines in a bit more technical granularity how to respond. What are the exact things that we need to look at when we're, for example, putting together a water program? What do we need to, I mean, do we need to measure the water table, or do we need to make sure that someone is there to monitor changes in the water table? This kind of thing is not the inherent knowledge of the humanitarian sector. It very much comes from the environmental and the science community. But can we package that in a way that makes sense and is capable of being absorbed by all organizations? Is it accessible? Is it not too long? And is it specific? That's the goal, and that's what's coming next.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I now have a couple of questions I'm pulling from the chat. I'll go first to Nishani and then Amir to see if you have anything to add. So Stan has written in the chat, after we've all signed up, then what do we do? Signing up seems to be the easy part. And we had a related question earlier. I'm just trying to scroll up to find it from Wendy. Oh, maybe I'm not going. Yes. What advice do you have to NGOs to avoid taking only superficial steps? For example, subscribing to service providers to help reduce carbon footprint through offsets, akin to, quote, greenwashing in favor of more substantive, impactful action per the commitment to action. Difficult question, but Nishani, let me start with you. Any thoughts? And then we'll move to Amir.
I think first and foremost, what we need to do is, if we're signing up to it, one of the things that we as ICVA mentioned in our motion to commitment to action is that we will try as best as possible, according to our size of the organizations and how we are, local, national, as Amir also mentioned, how can we practically take those commitments and look at them and say, okay, this is possible in the context we work, in the programs we're doing and the projects we're doing, and we're able to do it. So it's also being quite practical and looking at how can we apply it. One of the examples when I was talking about the charter and the kind of ways of working was, we use a lot of plastic in our NFI programs, for example, the jerry cans, etc. If we look at some of the local natural material that we use in different parts of the world, for example, in India or Sri Lanka, where I'm from, we use clay pots and aluminium pots for water collection, not just plastic jerry cans. But these are little things that, it's a basic thing in your programming. It means that, of course, there's going to be maybe an additional cost to replace, for example, the clay pots. But if you are having aluminium collection water pots, for example, that can be a replacement for a plastic jerry can. I'm just giving you a basic example. But the moment you kind of say this and people go, oh, yeah, that we can do. And we have a lot of expertise already within our organizations. When we were having a conversation with some of the NGOs, a relatively medium-sized NGO was mentioning, we have a climate change person, but we've never actually had a conversation with them to see how we can talk to them about how our programming can improve. So it's just some of these, things that we haven't had conversations between our own organizational departments, because we also have our own siloed approach. We have our development sector, we have a DRR, disaster management, we have our environment policies, and many of the environment, climate change experts that are now coming into organizations have actually an agriculture background or something like that, because that's kind of where this knowledge sits in. So how do we use this knowledge to be able to look at our own programs and our own operations and say, where can we be more environmentally friendly? For example, about the greening, etc. It's not just greening, it's trying not to do as much harm as, not to do harm in where we are working. I saw another from Max about, cutting down thousands of acres of forest in terms of setting up, IDP camps. And this happens. And this is where we as NGOs or we as organizations in the humanitarian sector need to advocate and highlight with our partners, be they the UN or be they with the government, to say, this is not a good site to put up an IDP camp if it's a new camp that we're setting up. How do we from that start say, where is the best place? Is it closer to water access, access points? Then if not, we have bowsering that we need to do. That means it's a fuel, consumption that is actually increasing our carbon footprint there. So there's all these little steps that can be done practically on the ground if we really look at how can we take those commitments and put it in practice. Over.
Thanks. Amir, could I throw the same question to you, but perhaps add in, we had a related question from Abdelaziz asking what should we as individual humanitarians be doing? So over to you, and then we'll wrap up.
No, it's a great, well, they're all great questions, and the three parts of a great question. True that signing up is the easy part, but inside that document that we sign is a commitment to start at least making changes within a year. And we all know how long things can change, how the machinery of an organization can dictate a timeline. But we do think that that commitment is powerful. And what we've heard is that many colleagues inside organizations who believe in the contents of the charter, who think that this is important, have used the charter itself as an internal advocacy tool to push organizations to start thinking about this in their own strategic decisions. So that's one thing. Another thing, and so for example, the ICRC has released a few targets, and we can share these, they're public, that accompanied their adoption of the charter. One, and this is in terms of operations, is to factor climate risks into all programs. And that language is intentional in that we are not saying that in all programs we will respond to climate change, because it may not be relevant to all programs. But what we've tried to do is start to engender a change in how we look at our work, to make sure that a lens is placed on our work that takes into account risks that are generated by climate change and environmental degradation. And what is really great is, in fact, often we do this already. When an infrastructure project incorporates risk and needs to be designed, built, and monitored, our colleagues in that department are already looking at risks. What is the likelihood that rainfall will increase? What is the likelihood of an earthquake? These are non-conflict risks, but they are risks. And in order to implement a program effectively, they need to be considered. We just don't always think about what kind of risks we're looking at, and we don't always systematize it. That's one way to change, to make sure that when we're looking at the potential for variability in weather in our programs, that is factoring climate risk into our analysis, and it's essential. The other thing that we can do is to not silo, but distinguish between the greening efforts that we make and the programmatic changes that help communities respond to these crises. These are linked, certainly, but they are different processes. The greening piece is extremely important, but as we've said many times, the true value where humanitarians can make a real difference in whether or not people live is in making sure that the programs we implement respond to the risks that they face. And increasingly, some of those risks are caused by these crises. So making sure that we think clearly about those two streams can also help change how we act and clarify what is needed in next steps. How can individual humanitarians act? I'm going to sound counterintuitive, but this is a systems issue on the large scale. At an individual level, it's very much about the things that Nishani was talking about sometimes. It's about, bringing in sustainability practices, advocating for better practices, better procurement, taking the train. But those are things that we can do as people, humanitarians or not. The charter is talking about how can we transform the sector.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, Amir and Nishani. This has been, as someone just mentioned in the chat, very informative, I must agree. And as I said, a great start for the learning stream. We can see with all of the questions we weren't able to get to, we'll have plenty to talk about over the coming months. So thanks once again, both of you. And for everyone on the line, thanks so much for your engagement as well. If you would like to review the recording of the event, that will be available soon, so you can also share it with colleagues. That will be available in both video and an audio-only podcast format in the coming days. It will be posted on the event website, and also, of course, you'll get an email about that. The next session in the learning stream will take place on the 14th of October. We'll be focusing in on Commitment 1 and how humanitarian organizations are working on adapting to the impacts of the climate and environmental crises. And as always, there is an evaluation form for today's event. We hope you will take a minute to fill that out so that we can continue to improve our sessions. My colleague is posting the link for that in the chat, and you'll also receive an email with the link. We would be particularly interested in hearing from those of you who use the translated captions today, as that's something we'll be considering whether or not to move ahead with. So we hope they were useful, and if they were or if they were not, please do let us know in the evaluation. So with that, we'd like to thank everyone, both panelists again and participants, for a very interesting discussion, and we look forward to seeing you online again very soon. And Herod Lang signing off from Geneva. Bye-bye.